So now we have our VDBs. So let's set them up inside our mesh network. So to start a mesh network, let's go ahead into the mesh tab and click here. This is create mesh network. Let's open up the outliner to see what it's done. So you see we've got a mesh and a mesh insta. Now, if your mesh defaults to being a mesh repro, you can change that by going to the mesh. If you go into the FX menu here, FX mesh, in the utilities, you can go across and just switch mesh geometry type. So if you've got a repro mesh, then you can change it to an instancer like what we've got here. So we're going to go with using an instancer for this particular setup. So first, let's name this so that it carries its name across to the instancer. So let's call this mesh clouds. And you see we've got mesh clouds instancer, so that's great. Let's just import our VDBs now, and then we can plug those into our network as we build it. So go over to the Arnold tab, and we've got this little cube here which is create volume. So we can use this to create a volume with Arnold, and if we press F to frame it, just creates it the origin. So open up the attribute editor, and in the file name we just want to open that up and grab the VDBs from wherever we saved them. So I've put them into a little folder here, and Cloud A, the one we've created, I've created some variations here, so I'll just load Cloud A in for now. So there it is, and the first thing we're going to want to do is shade it. So what we can do is open up Hypershade, and let's just create an AI standard volume shader. Let's just drag this out, scale it down so we can apply it. Where is it? There it is. Let's just call this Cloud Matte and select our VDB, and let's assign a material to viewport selection. And let's rename our volume, just call it Cloud A for the time being. And let's just have a quick render of that and see what it looks like. Maybe we hide the, let's hide Control H, hide an object. Let's hide the height field and just have the cloud on its own. There it is. So it's not bad. It looks a bit dense though, so let's just dial in the density for our cloud material. So grab that, and we've got the density control here. Let's just scale this window down so we can see things a bit easier. There we are. Right, so let's go to 0.1 and see what we get. Yeah, it's a bit more cloudy, isn't it? Maybe a bit lower, 0.05. We don't want a lot of density with this, so that looks like a good sort of starting point. So we'll leave it with that, and then let's clone it, Control D, just move it across, and let's call this new one Cloud B, and load in the variant, the Cloud B variant. I'm just going to go ahead and load in each of the variants and assign, well, this should have the shader assigned now, so we just clone them, the container, so to speak. So let's just load in any variations you might have, like what I'm doing here. That way we can just pipe them into our mesh setup when we're ready. So let's grab Cloud D. Okay, so those are the 5 cloud variations I've done, and I'll just show you what they look like. They're all created with the same sort of method, so some of them are less dense, so you might need, if you were to do what I've done and create some variations, you might want to mess around with perhaps different shaders or whatever, but I'm just going to leave them with the same shader for the time being. And I quite like the fact that there's sort of a good variation amongst them. So Now what we can do is start our scattering process. So let's open up our outliner and let's do a bit of housekeeping before we proceed. So let's grab the clouds and group them, Control G to group, and just label that clouds, or better yet, cloud VDBs, yeah, just so we can keep track of those. Now at this point, it would be good to unhide our height field just so we can keep an eye on the scale of things. So that's Shift H to unhide. Right, so we're going to want a plane. It's going to be roughly the same size as this. I think this was 1000. Well, the scale units will be different because it was from Houdini. So let's just create a plane and let's just scale it up to 100. No, 1000. Okay, no, the units are fine. Okay, so this will be our scattering plane. We can distort this or whatever, but for the time being, just keep it simple. I'm just going to put it slightly above the height field, but not above all of the peaks, so we get a nice sort of smattering of cloud layers. So let's go back into Mesh now. We can do this. We don't actually need the outliner. We can also go to the Mesh and click here, which is the Mesh editor. I'll bring it over. So in Mesh, you have all of these different nodes you can add to the Mesh network to get different effects. We're just going to hone in a couple of them just for the scattering. So first you start off with a distribute node, and you want to switch this to mesh. We're going to use this as a scattering mesh for the clouds. And then just grab the outliner, bring that back. We'll call our plane cloud scatter plane. Go back to our distribute and just middle mouse click and drag it to your input mesh. And we can't see anything yet because we haven't input any geometry or anything into our network. So let's go ahead and do that. So the mesh instancer is what we'll want. Open up the Cloud VDB group, select all of the clouds that you've got, and then select the instancer and add selection. So there we've got the 5 clouds in the instancer, and you can see they've appeared. Now we've only got 10, because if we go back to our mesh clouds and to the distribute, we've only got 10. But if we crank this up to say 500, you see we've got a bunch of clouds, but they're all the same. So we're not getting all our variations here. The way we can introduce that, because we've given them to our cloud instance, so the way we can introduce that is go back to our nodes and put in an ID node, and it will put 5 different IDs into the mesh, so you can get different each ID to each cloud. So we want to have it random, and this is sometimes I've noticed this is a glitch with mesh actually. Sometimes when you put things like Arnold instance, Arnold stand-ins and volumes, it sometimes doesn't show the variations that you've put in, even though you've even got an ID node. So I don't think that's something to worry about. If we just change the seed, yeah, we're not getting a change there. Let's do a test render. Okay, so I went back and checked what was happening, and it looks to me like basically because one of our clouds has got so much more density than the others, it's just a case of we're not seeing it. So if we just hide our height field and render, we'll see our clouds. So here's all our cloud variations, and they're too small. So the first thing we want to do is really scale these up. So we've got our variations. Now, another way to mess around with the variation and with the scale is if we introduce a random node. So let's grab one of those now. And we've got a bunch of controls here. First thing we want to do is the scale. So let's tick uniform scale, and let's scale our clouds up. By ticking uniform scale, what this does just means that you can just scale up one of the axes and they'll all scale up together uniformly. So let's scale it to, say, 15. So we've got a whole bunch of different size clouds, and let's break it up some more. Let's just rotate all of our clouds randomly in 180 degrees on each axis. So now we've got a ton of variation. Let's render again. So that is something, but not quite the look we're going for. So I think we're going to need to reduce our density before we proceed, because they look quite dense now. So we might have to go for really low values. So let's go to 0.01 and see what that looks like. Yeah, that could work. Perhaps a bit higher. Yeah. I think we're getting a little bit too much density on cloud A, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and just drop another AI standard volume and label it cloud low, and I'm just going to apply that to my cloud A, so assign, and I'm going to give that a really low density, 0.01, and then increase the density of my other ones just to balance things out a bit. Yeah, that's looking a bit better. Maybe a little bit lower for cloud low, if that's possible. Let's see how far we can push it. I guess that's as far as we can go. So that looks a lot better, I think. Now, it's important to see what it looks like against the height field. So let's unhide our mountains again. And actually, while we're there, let's hide our scatter plane, because we don't need that right now. And let's just see what this is looking like now. Yeah, that's looking a lot better. We've got kind of a nice sort of subtle cloud covering. Now, if we go to our render cam, let's see what it looks like from there. I just remembered when I went into my Houdini, I actually exported that really long cloud that I used as an example. So that's probably why I've got a lot of these, my variants. My cloud A is actually quite a long cloud, which doesn't sort of lend itself to rotating a lot of variations. But for the time being, we'll just go with that. But yeah, we've got quite a nice look going on here. They're quite subtle, but that will do for now. Perhaps the only thing that might be worth playing around with is reducing the scale of the scatter plane, or just increasing the amount of clouds that we've got scattering, because in this sort of window we're viewing, we've not got that many clouds, considering we've got about 500 or so. Perhaps we're only seeing maybe 10% of them. So if we go back to our distribute, maybe we increase it a little bit more to 800. Just have another test render of that. But that's the basics for setting up a scatter with Mash. And we're going to use the same technique in the next lesson a similar technique in the next lesson. We're going to have a look at the terrestrial ecosystem briefly, and use that to just scatter some tree geometry around the height field when we proceed. So that will be the next lesson.